So you're doing the work, training, eating right, managing your stress, but something's still off, right? The energy's not there, recovery's slower, your body comp's shifting, your brain isn't sharp as it used to be. And most guys chalk this up to aging. And I'm here to tell you that your mitochondria are possibly failing you. And that's a fixable problem, similar to having your hormones out of whack. My name is Dr. Ryan Hewitt in Weaponized Body, and here today I'm going to talk to you about three of the most powerful compounds in mitochondrial medicine right now. And the ones I'm going to hit on are NAD+, MOTS-c, and SS31. So these are peptides that are on the cutting edge of research, backed with some information, but I'm going to be upfront about this as usual when I'm talking about peptides. This episode's educational only. None of this is medical advice or prescriptive, and none of these compounds should be used without proper labs, clinical oversight from a qualified practitioner. And just to keep in mind, these are serious tools that require a calculated protocol and making sure that you're managing these things with intelligent medicine. So now that I've got that out of the way, why are so many people talking about these mitochondrial peptides? Your mitochondria, first of all, are your little power plants or your little engines that produce something called ATP. So, that is the energy currency that powers every single cell in your body, right? Your heart, your brain, your muscle, and your hormones. And none of it functions without this currency called ATP. Now, after the age of 40, what happens is your mitochondrial efficiency starts to drop. So things like oxidative stress, you call it cellular rust, starts to build up. And, NAD plus, for example, levels off by as much as what's found as 50%. And when your mitochondria decline, everything tends to decline with it, right? Energy, your body composition, cognitive function, hormone production, AKA your recovery in general. So the conventional model tends to treat these downstream, at the symptom level, one by one. But what we're going to do is go straight to the source, right? And there's three compounds that can potentially improve those mechanisms. So buckle in. Let's get after this. So compound number one, you've probably been hearing a lot about, is one called NAD+. So this is where you want to start, because everything else we talk about today either requires NAD+ or is designed to protect it. So NAD+ stands for nicotinamide adenine dinucleotide, by the way. You don't need to remember that, but it's the master coenzyme of cellular energy production. And it's the molecule of your mitochondria that uses to convert food into, remember that energy currency, ATP. It also activates, longevity genes, which regulate things like your fat oxidation, DNA repair, inflammation, and overall just cellular aging. So herein lies the problem. NAD drops dramatically with age. As I mentioned, by your 50s, you might have half the NAD plus you had at the age of 20, like literally half. So it's not a minor insufficiency. And remember, that's your engine that's running on, two cylinders instead of four. So low NAD means like poor mitochondrial output. And what that means is everything we just described, like fatigue, brain fog, weight gain, slow recovery, it's upstream of almost every system in men in their 40s and 50s that they complain about. So how do you restore NAD+? Well, you probably heard people talk about oral precursors. There are supplements out there called NMN or NR, and these are accessible. Both of these convert to NAD plus in the body and work well for like maintenance or foundational support. But more potent ways to increase NAD plus would be, for example, IV NAD plus, which is faster. It bypasses the conversion entirely and it just completely floods your system. This is best for people who have significant deficits, right? Post-illness recovery, post-COVID, those who want like acute performance boost, for example. I'm most familiar with subcutaneous NAD plus, which is increasingly being used in clinical practice. This is like you could do daily low dose injections or bi-weekly larger dose injections subcutaneously that maintain more steady state levels with really great absorption and strong compliance, right? So it's where the clinical application, I think, is headed. So people who are candidates for this, virtually everyone over 40, especially anyone who has chronic fatigue or poor sleep quality, metabolic disruption, brain fog. I mentioned, long COVID symptoms, for example, but anybody who has like active metabolic disease, though, cancer, for example, has to be really cautious. You definitely want to be working with, your practitioner if you are considering this and you have, any type of chronic disease. So, think of NAD plus as the foundation, and then everything else is stacks on top of it. The compound number 2 we'll talk about, and this one's getting a lot of attention, called MOTS-c. MOTS-c is it's an amino acid peptide, and it's encoded by your own DNA, right? It was discovered, I think, recently in 2015, and it's classified as what's considered an exercise mimetic, meaning it mimics the effects of exercise in several metabolic benefits that are happening with physical training. So your body does make this naturally. And the problem is that MOTS-c expression does decrease with aging. So by the time you're in your 40s or 50s, for example, you also have significantly less of the signal in your body that depends on your body depends on to regulate your metabolism. MOTS-c also reduces insulin resistance, right? So therefore, it combats things like obesity, improves your muscular function. It supports things like bone metabolism, immune regulation. So in other words, it slows down aging. And the primary mechanism is of what's called AMPK activation. So I want you to know this because this is your master metabolic switch. So when AMPK fires, your cells shift from fat storage to fat burning. There's something else that it increases too, called GLUT4. You might have heard of some biochemists talk about this, GLUT4 expression, which is the insulin responsive glucose transporter. So this drives glucose in your muscle tissue rather than converting it into stored fat. So obviously preferred for people that are trying to build muscle, burn fat, improve performance. So the picture that matters for my listeners, for example, is like, let's say you have a guy in his late 40s, carries a little bit of extra weight around the middle, your insulin sensitivity is declining, and you're doing the work, right? You're training, you're eating a protein-based whole food diet, you're sleeping, but you're finding that the results aren't matching the effort, okay? It's possible that your mitochondrial health isn't signaling properly, and MOTS-c is one of the key signals that goes quiet. So systemic MOTS-c treatment, reverse diet-induced obesity and diet age-dependent insulin resistance in animal models, for example. We're lacking a lot of like human studies with this, as is the knock for most peptides at this moment. But this is the signal it's supposed to generate. So, MOTS-c is, for example, banned by WADA, which is the World Anti-Doping Agency. So, if you're a competitive athlete getting drug tested, don't do this. And again, this is a peptide that's delivered subcutaneous. And once again, you want to make sure you're getting routine labs and having a practitioner help you monitor, the effects and benefits of this. And lastly, as I mentioned, it has strong animal data, but human studies are still expanding. So we're still lacking data. I do believe this one is on the frontier of, some of the most exciting peptides, though. Okay, the third and final compound I wanted to talk about when it comes to mitochondrial health and the peptide discussion is one called SS31. It's also called, and forgive my pronunciation of this, is lamipretide. So you might hear lamipretide or SS31 is easier to say, but it's in a different category from everything else that we've discussed. And for example, most compounds work around the mitochondria and they influence signaling pathways. They boost precursors and they activate enzymes, right? So SS31, though, goes inside the mitochondria and crosses the cell membrane. Okay, it crosses the outer mitochondrial membrane and works directly on the inner membrane where ATP is actually produced. And what it targets is something called cardiolipin. It's a critical phospholipid on the inner membrane, once again, and it stabilizes the mitochondrial architecture. Okay, and this makes energy production or ATP production more efficient and reduces oxidative stress. So I really like the research around this space. It's pretty cool. There is research that showed that it restored mitochondrial energy to younger levels in aged mice within an hour, right? 8 days of treatment led to increased whole animal endurance capacity. So there's some pretty cool, again, animal studies. Most or more recent research confirmed that this SS31 compound improved ADP sensitivity in aging muscle, meaning the mitochondria can properly receive and process this energy signal. And that's directly correlated with muscular force and cardiac function. So in older adults, for example, SS31 has been shown to restore exercise tolerance, improve oxygen utilization. So you're getting better benefits from the work you're doing, right, from exercise. There's also cool things happening in neurological models. It reduced neural loss and improved cognitive function by protecting mitochondrial structural integrity, right? So it basically slows the aging process, slows telomere shortening, and which are two of the core hallmarks of biological aging. So we could talk about best candidates, which once again seems to be the consensus, men and women over the age of 40 with significant fatigue, cardio concerns, even neurodegenerative risk, poor recovery from exercise, or anything, with a known mitochondrial component, right? So it's a strong fit for like post-surgical recovery, anyone coming back from serious illness. These are also delivered by subcutaneous injection. This one has pretty strong clinical evidence as far as animal models, but people right now, we're not getting a lot of studies with people. It doesn't mean that it's not effective. It just means we need more clinical workup on this particular peptide. And one of the things that people ask about is like, well, which one do I use and how do they work together? So let me see if I can simplify a little bit for you, maybe summarize and give you an idea. So these peptides belong in the same conversation. Number one, NAD plus, just think of this as the fuel. So without NAD plus, your mitochondria can't do their job, which is to produce ATP, remember, and it doesn't, your neither compound gets full traction, for example, of like MOTS-c or SS31. So NAD plus is the base, okay? Now MOTS-c is the metabolic signal. So it tells your cells to activate fat burning, improve insulin sensitivity, and behave the way you did when you were younger, for example. And now, lastly, SS31 is the structural repair. Okay, so this gets inside the mitochondria and fixes the machinery itself, which restores the efficiency that age and oxidative damage have taken away. So you can see how they all act differently, right? NAD is the fuel, MOTS-c is the signal, and SS31 is the structural repair. So they target like three independent pathways, which is why stacking these, for example, under the right clinical protocols can produce results that no single compound can achieve alone, right? So the bottom line is like fatigue, brain fog, stubborn body fat, or recovery that takes twice as long can be your biology telling your cells that you're not producing energy efficiently anymore. And these are three compounds that can target ways to address that at the source. Again, I want to be clear about something before you go deep dive on your own, that these aren't just like supplements you order on Amazon, right? MOTS-c and SS31 are injectable peptides with specific dosing windows, and like the clinical outcomes depend heavily on what your labs actually show. NAD plus protocols vary based on your metabolic baseline too. And without that foundation, you're just completely guessing. Guessing with these compounds is a waste of time and your money and can be counterproductive. So I want to remind everybody that these compounds are not going to be easy buttons for you. If you have like sluggish mitochondria because you're sleeping like garbage, or you're not, doing routine aerobic and weight training exercise, you're not eating a protein-based whole food diet, at caloric maintenance or slight deficit, not drinking enough water, and managing and dealing with stress properly, then these compounds aren't, they're not going to create, they're just going to be like a little bit of a band-aid. They're not going to actually get you a long-term result. So if you want to know like where you actually stand, I want to encourage you to make sure you get a full hormonal and metabolic assessment, right? And build the protocol around your specific biology. These are things we do at Weaponized Wellness, with our lab work, with our protocols, with our medical oversight, and that's what we do. So first of all, making sure that your hormones are healthy, making sure you're doing the work, and getting the result from the hard work you're doing. So I hope this episode was helpful. For those of you who are interested in these mitochondrial peptides, and deep diving into more education around the space, and talking to more individuals that are more savvy about these topics, and, getting good quality information and making sure if you are wanting to get into this space and start getting prescribed peptides, that you're going to great sources. Weaponizedwellness.com. You check that out. There's 2 different lab panels you can get through the company. As I said, we go through all of these very thoroughly with you, make sure we design a specific lifestyle, supplementation, and or peptide hormone protocol, to suit your needs to really help you with your performance, health, recovery, and there you are. There you have it. So if you have any questions, as always, I invite anybody to reach out to me, Dr. Ryan at theweaponizedbody.com. Thank you for listening, and I'll check you guys on the next episode.